want to welcome you all to our Rare Reads author series. If you've been here before, you've seen me. My name's Christy, and I'm the manager of marketing and communications here at Rare. And I'm also the host of Rare Reads, where every month we choose a book that inspires us with thought provoking and solutions oriented storytelling for climate change and the environment. If you haven't done so already, please be sure to check out rare.org/rare-reads to see all of our book picks, our previous author talks with Ben Goldfarb and Earl Swift, and to sign up for our mailing list if you haven't done so yet. And stay tuned for our next book pick, which we'll be releasing next week. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions in advance of our conversation today. We're going to get to those in the last 25 minutes or so of our conversation. And if you come up with any questions during our conversation today, please feel free to use the Q&A chat function at the bottom of the screen. We'll be monitoring those and getting to as many as we can. Today, I'm so excited to welcome author and agroecologist Dr. Liz Carlisle to talk with me about her 2022 book, Healing Grounds: Climate Justice and the Deep Roots of Regenerative Farming. It's a powerful account of BIPOC female farmers across the United States who exemplify the true heart of regenerative agriculture. And that means not just a set of technical tricks to store carbon in the ground, but it's a holistic approach that values diversity in both plants and people. The book challenges us to face our nation's agricultural history, which is marked by discrimination and displacement, and which has blocked many farmers and people of color from owning land and building wealth. But by coming together and restoring these farmlands, we can not only heal our planet, but also our communities and ourselves. Liz is an associate professor of environmental studies at UC Santa Barbara, where she teaches courses on food and farming. She's written 3 books about regenerative farming and agroecology. The first was Lentil Underground, the second Grain by Grain, and most recently, Healing Grounds. She's also a frequent contributor to both academic journals and popular media outlets focusing on food and farm policy, incentivizing soil health practices, and supporting new entry farmers. She holds a PhD from geography from UC Berkeley and a BA in folklore and mythology from Harvard. Welcome, Liz. Thanks so much for joining me today.
So great to be here, Christy. Thanks for the invitation.
Of course. I mean, I couldn't not invite you to chat with me because, as I showed you earlier, my copy of Healing Grounds is completely marked up. I enjoyed this book so much, and I learned so much about our nation's agricultural history that I truly didn't know about. So I'm really excited to chat with you about it today. To start, I was really interested in knowing a little bit more about what an agroecologist is. It's a term that I don't know that I'd heard before. So I'm wondering if you could go into your background a little bit and tell us what that is and how you got interested in this work.
Yeah. I know at least a few agroecologists on the call too. I know a couple of students in my class who are agroecologists and probably some others. But we agroecologists are interested in the full web of relationships on farm, from the soil to the plants to the people. And we are a group of researchers, but also farmers and also advocates. So that term also kind of spans people working in different ways. And we all have come to this work in so many different ways. So I guess I'm, one example of many of how you come to agroecology. I think the deep reason why I'm interested in this work around how, as Rare does, how people and nature come together, and specifically through the food system, is that my grandmother lost our family farm in the Dust Bowl. And I was lucky to have a lot of time with her when I was young. And she told me both about, her early life growing up on this farm where her family grew a lot of their food. And she was really directly involved with land in their livelihood. But then also what it was like, the real trauma of losing that land connection, that family business, and sort of picking up from that point. And so she really inspired me to think about how, if we as a society can take better care of our soil and our land, we can avoid those kinds of traumatic moments where people are disconnected from land and from livelihood. So that was the kind of spark for me. And I've always been interested in hearing other people's stories about their land connection. I was in a folklore program as an undergraduate, which gave me a lot of space to talk with rural Americans about those stories. And then I was really inspired by actually an organic farmer from my home state of Montana, John Tester. Maybe some folks on the call know that name, who ran for US Senate on a platform around moving our state away from extractive industry to more renewable and regenerative industries like organic agriculture and renewable energy. And it was really through working in that office that I heard from farmers in Montana who were moving to more organic and regenerative systems, often for economic reasons. That was kind of the spark that led me to go to grad school and do a research project with those farmers, and kind of led to where I am today, doing a combination of talking with some of these incredible farmers making these transitions and trying to write about it in ways that honor their work, and then working with students who are the next generation of these leaders on the land.
That's incredible. It gives so much context that I didn't know about for this book. I mean, I went to Montana for the first time last year as part of a graduate program I was in for science writing. And
Mm,
we also spoke with a lot of farmers and ranchers that were moving towards regenerative practices, and they didn't quite fit the mold that I think we all think of when we think of like regenerative farming as being, almost like a I guess there's almost like it's like a hippie thing. Like I think in the like in the mainstream media, but it was really, really eye-opening to see all of these generational farmers and ranchers moving towards these practices and reclaiming some of the older practices.
mm,
That it's not just a new thing. Um, and what you just described about your grandmother and that generational farm, you mentioned in the introduction to the book that the story of US agriculture was a story that you thought you knew. And I'm that and it's on page 10, and I think that phrase that you put in there, like that really hooked me because I was like, well, what was that story that she thought she knew? And then how did that evolve as you wrote this book? Could you go a little bit into that? That's sort of before and after.
yeah. I mean, so my family story very much did inspire me to try to understand like what went wrong here. Why wasn't it possible for us to still be working that family farm? Why don't I get to have that experience? And so the first thing I learned about was really what changed in U.S. agriculture after World War II, which was a really dramatic time of change. We had all of this infrastructure for producing chemicals for wartime that was then applied to agriculture. And so, right after World War II, there was a dramatic increase in the degree to which our agriculture was really shaped by industrial fertilizers and pesticides and herbicides, and increasing mechanization too, but especially those synthetic chemicals. And so our crops were bred to yield well with those synthetic chemicals. And this was an international story as well, too, that has a lot to do with our involvement in Mexico and sort of using developing countries as a sort of proving ground for these green revolution approaches. And so I had sort of thought that the story of what went wrong with US agriculture started in that period in like the late 40s and 50s. And I was really focused on these sort of technologies and all of the consolidation that had happened in agriculture, the sort of concentration of power in the corporations that were making the inputs that US agriculture is now, largely driven by. And all of that is true. And yet, what I learned in researching this book is that that was all really just an extension of a process that had started hundreds of years earlier in terms of really shifting the logic of US agriculture away from a kind of mutual benefit between people and land to this more extractive paradigm where people are sort of trying to get resources out of land to move somewhere else. And that if I wanted to understand how we really go regenerative in a way that meets the scale of the challenge of something like climate change or just the changes in water that people in the West are seeing, that we would need to go back to that root moment when we moved away from a more reciprocal relationship with land to a more extractive relationship with land in producing our food.
Yeah. And it's something that really struck me as interesting is I've heard a lot of people say regenerative agriculture and sort of, use that phrase a lot. And it almost gives the impression of like a buzzword. Um,
Mm,
And because it gives the impression of a buzzword, it also gives the impression of something that's like new and sort of cutting edge, and like, regenerative agriculture is this new thing. And I think it's an amazing thing that people are talking about it and we're learning more about it. But I'm interested in, going a little bit deeper with your research, how this reciprocal relationship between land and people is really embedded in different cultures, indigenous cultures throughout the world. Can you talk about the difficulties of talking about regenerative agriculture as like a new concept when actually there's this whole history behind it?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I started to hear this sentiment as I was in, organic conferences and things, and people were starting to use the word regenerative, maybe 10 years ago, 7, 8 years ago. And often there would be people who were maybe involved in like a traditional ecological knowledge session or a food justice session. And I heard this kind of frustration bubbling up of like, oh my God, like, don't you understand? Like these are practices that our communities have been using for thousands of years. And we've just been struggling to even be heard at this conference and feeling like we're on the margins. And now instead of people embracing, this message we've been trying to bring, they're just giving it this new name and then they're acting like they came up with it. So I think there is a lot of frustration and anger because indeed, whether you're talking about agroforestry or cover cropping or more minimum tillage systems. These are all things that you find precedents for in Africa, in Latin America, in East Asia that go back thousands of years. And interestingly, even some of the really famous books that, like organic agriculture pioneers wrote. You think about Sir Albert Howard's work. These are folks who went, in his case, to East Asia and learned from these smallholder farmers, and then translated, in Sir Albert Howard's case, those composting systems for a Western audience that then helped drive the organic movement in the US and the UK. Or there's also a really powerful story about how enslaved Africans brought these knowledge systems around growing rice to the US that then were critical to like building the economy of South Carolina in the colonial days. And so there's ways in which these knowledges have been sort of co-opted, or we've sort of forgotten where they came from. And I think it's important for a number of reasons, obviously for equity reasons, also because all of these practices only get us so far unless we sustain them. And I think that is what is so important about the cultures and societies and governance systems and value systems that co-developed with these practices, is that those are innovations that allow a practice to be sustained over multiple generations, which is what really does things like store carbon in the soil or protect a watershed over generations. And so if we want regenerative agriculture to really be effective in responding to climate change or drawing down carbon, we need to call on the people who understand the sort of social and cultural piece of sustaining these practices rather than just the like super cool 2-year demo that then, whatever goes into another land use when it's done.
Yeah. And that's I'm just my brain is buzzing with all the different things that you're saying, because at Rare that's really sort of at the core of what we do as well. So our regenerative agriculture program is based really in Colombia at the moment, and you can see the sort of transition that a country like Colombia, which has been known as like the breadbasket of the world, is has had to sort of adapt to this big agriculture, like need to use pesticides in order to keep up with,
Mm,
like global food production. And what you see when you have people, learning about regenerative agriculture practices and really tapping into that, historical and like these generational practices that had been there all along. And
mm,
like you see this resurgence within the farming communities in Colombia of like bringing those practices back. It's really a powerful thing.
mm, mm,
So, I mean, it's really, really interesting. And you mentioned in your answer just now about the different people that had sort of written books and really, kind of brought this idea forward quite a long time ago. But as I was reading the book, I was thinking a lot about Braiding Sweetgrass and
Mm,
even Silent Spring.
mm,
Like two, I think, very seminal works that brought these concepts of, you know, in the case of Silent Spring, the different chemicals that we're using, and in the case of Braiding Sweetgrass, I think Robin Wall Kimmerer really opened up the conversation for all of us to talk about our relationship with the land and to think differently about it. And you quote Kimmerer in the book, and I think the epigraph to the book is from Braiding Sweetgrass. Can you talk a little bit about how you see your book, Healing Grounds, in conversation with these other, sort of important works that have really brought this conversation forward?
Well, those are definitely two of my heroes right there. So I am privileged, to be in conversation with either of those women, or yeah, just to get to read their work. Honestly, both have been incredibly inspiring to me. And I think that's what's important is sort of how we in agriculture relate to Silent Spring or braiding sweetgrass. Do we see the environmental movement, which I think, Silent Spring in many ways helped to catalyze the sort of current US based environmental movement? Uh, do we see the environmental movement as an ally, or do we see the environmental movement as, an enemy? And similarly, do we see traditional ecological knowledge as, a group of allies who we should really consult and learn from, or do we see this as an oppositional relationship? And so I think in a lot of my writing, and I know that you're a science writer as well, so to kind of like nerd out on sort of writing and communication as art forms as well, I think it's about how we bridge and show that these are, two groups of people who have different histories, but who are working towards shared goals. And I think that our success in agriculture really depends on us seeing ourselves as working hand in hand with the environmental movement and with holders of traditional ecological knowledge, rather than this sort of like sense that we're in this fortress that we have to protect from
Mhm.
activists who come from either of those two communities. And so I think language can really help to show those bridges. And I think that's part of what I loved about writing this book around the stories of these four women, all of whom I think in their dreams are very recognizable to people I know in the agricultural community, some of whom may fear or feel nervous about the environmental movement or traditional ecological knowledge movement as things that may challenge their way of life or their values. But I think these women in this book are all working towards goals that are so familiar to people in agricultural communities like, central and eastern Montana, around, honoring their family legacy, building a good life on land that's accessible to future generations. So I think using language to show that we in agriculture have so much to learn from folks in the environmental movement and from folks holding traditional ecological knowledge. And ultimately, it will help us get where we want to go if we work together in a humble way with those folks.
Yeah, and what you're talking about right now really centers, and which is something that I really love about the book too, is it centers people at
Mm,
core of regenerative agriculture. Anything that's really going to move the needle forward has to center on people. And I have the quote, and I've used it on the web page for this event, and because it just really spoke to me. But it's regenerative agriculture can only be fully realized when the entire web is repaired so that the interconnected parts can function as a whole. This means attending to a component of the farm often left out of scientific discussions, which is people. Um,
mm,
and that's such a powerful, it's such a powerful sentiment because I think it's true. I think that, people are often left out of the conversation, or, people get siloed into different like thought echo chambers, I suppose.
mm.
Um, so it's interesting to hear you talk about that.
Yeah, and I mean, this is actually, I think, one of the most powerful pieces of Robin Wall Kimmerer's book that sticks with me too. I specifically think about her Three Sisters chapter, where she, of course, talks about corn and beans and squash and really eloquently, honors each of these three beings. And then she talks about human beings as the fourth sister and reminds us that, corn, beans, and squash are not wild plants. They wouldn't exist in this form without people. People selected from their wild ancestors over generations and generations to create, yes, these three plants that work really well with each other, but are also interconnected with human stewardship in order to continue to thrive. And so I think that's a really important part to remember is that, again, with all of our dreams of a regenerative agriculture that helps repair our home place, our planet, and helps us respond to climate change. It's not the kind of thing that you set it and forget it. People remain an integrated part of any one of those practices or systems, really in perpetuity. And so that's why it's also a cultural and social project is how do we create a culture, a governance system, a society, or remember, cultures and governance systems and societies that have the capacity to sustain things that last way longer than individual lifetimes.
Yeah, and and again, and this is why like when I read this book, I knew I had to bring it to this audience, at Rare because that's also what we do is like really um holding at the center of environmental movements the unique communities that are stewarding each of these, whether it's a small scale fishing community in the Philippines or a small holder farmer in Colombia. Those communities, those governance systems are really at the core of making sustainable, lasting change.
Mm.
Um, I'm drilling a little bit more into the book and talking about people. You identify these four incredible women, they're that are doing, different things from agroforestry to, bringing back the seven sisters. Having a conversation about the seven sisters this morning, so apologies. Um, but the three sisters, um, so there's these four women that you focus on in the book, and you bring in a lot of different um, uh, experts and that sort of lend you know their sort of unique um, view on different things throughout the book, but it really does center on these four women. And I'm curious to hear a little bit more about how you found each of these people, and how gender and they're also all women of color. How does how do all of these different factors sort of play into how you identified and found these women, to center on in the book?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I guess I have the privilege of having been, working in the agroecology field, organic and regenerative agriculture for a little over a decade. And so what's been cool about that is a lot of chances to be a fly in the wall, on a farm tour in a conference and just get to have my mind blown by incredible leaders in this movement. And so when I started researching this book and I started thinking about a more historical way of thinking about a sort of historically informed way of thinking about what regenerative agriculture is that goes back further than that World War II history, but really looks at how do we regenerate and repair the last, 400, 500 years of agriculture on this continent. I knew I really needed to talk to Indigenous leaders. I knew I needed to talk to African American Black leaders, and I knew I needed to talk to immigrant leaders as well, whose ancestors had been part of the labor forces in the last century that have helped build up industrial agriculture, but also whose home places have been sort of, sacrifice zones for this experiment in green revolution agriculture and the global trade system that we have around the food system now. And so as I sort of, just got to be this fly on the wall, started talking to folks about, connect me with some people or tell me some people whose work I need to learn more about. I wasn't necessarily asking, tell me about women, but people just kept pointing me to women. So that was interesting. That was not something I necessarily expected. And that's a piece I've kind of reflected on post facto. It's like, oh, is that telling me something about, women's roles in agriculture, before this industrial time? I've learned some really interesting things about, places where women seed savers were really critical to these regenerative systems. And that was a role specifically reserved for women, or women tree stewards, as people stewarding a perennial system when maybe men had more responsibility for an animal system or an annual system. But I think it's easier for me to see actually in the reverse, because it's not at all hard for me to see, as a woman in this time, growing up in Montana that when I see a truck commercial during the Super Bowl that is in an agricultural setting, that the protagonist who is celebrated as the farmer is likely to be male. So I think there's clearly, a need for us to see more inclusively in terms of gender and agriculture in the United States right now. And we have this opportunity, I think, to look more fully at a broader cultural history around the world of who has participated in food systems. Yeah. And honestly, there's so many brilliant people working in this field that it's obviously challenging to sort of narrow down into these sort of four main characters. But I really wanted readers to feel like they got to know people in this sense of like, how does regenerative agriculture connect to their deep sense of mission and purpose? And we have a lot of books that celebrate, a story like mine, honestly, of a descendant of a homesteading family who's trying to recover or hold on to some family history in agriculture. And so I think in some ways we know those cultural reference points for why regeneration might be meaningful to an individual in the United States. But I thought it was important for readers to see that there's a really large and key group of people who actually have different cultural reference points, who don't come from this lineage of homesteading, but who come from a lineage of, they had ancestors who were enslaved. And yet before that, they had ancestors who were leading these food sovereign systems in Africa. And they are reaching back to that history, as well as recovering the piece of, hey, there was some really important stewardship that happened even in the context of slavery. Or people who come from these immigrant histories who both have this pride connected to food systems back home and also, brought seeds with them and managed to hold on to aspects of that even while working as farm workers on industrial systems, for example. So those other cultural reference points around, meaning and purpose for people and participating in repair are so important. And so I wanted to have the chance to kind of go in depth with these individuals so you see why this is more than just a technical practice for somebody or even like an intellectual interest, but it really is about their core purpose and mission in this life.
Yeah, and one of the things that I read in the book that really, really shocked and surprised me,
Mm.
that I don't even know if there's a question connected to this, so apologies in advance, but I'm just gonna talk about it. You talk about when white Europeans came over to the Americas, and what they wrote in their journals was actually that they were seeing these food systems that were thriving, that the indigenous communities that were living here had, food in abundance. And then
Mm.
you know, and then you qualify that by saying, but in order to like fully admit that would be to say that, these communities are the stewards of this land. And when you're in a land grab, a colonialist land grab, that's kind of, that's counterintuitive. So of course, then they had to, you know, destroy these thriving food systems. And I think the part that really just shocked me was that it's written in these journals that people, that these settlers came in and were like, wow, look at how much food is like, look at how well this is working. And then they destroyed it. And that to me was so shocking because you sort of, like, we know the colonial history to like a certain extent, right? Like we learn about it to some extent, and of course it's whitewashed and it's sanitized, and that's not great. But to know that it was written down is was totally mind-blowing to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. I was drawing on Jane Mount Pleasant's work, who's an incredible historian and scientist whose work has actually worked on replicating some of the indigenous farming systems in the Northeast and has also like poured through these archives. But it's interesting to think about the position of some of the people who wrote that. And I think it's helpful to remember that they were taking orders from very powerful people in a very hierarchical society. and then their own sort of consciousness was probably somewhat complex, and so I guess we can thank that complexity for their observations, and their ability to sort of see what was in front of them and to see the contradiction that this was in fact a thriving agricultural society, and yet their sort of patrons, the people they answered to, were going to need to represent it as needing conquest in order to be productive. And so it helps you think about, this is a human being in this situation who, although they are participating in this oppressive history, at the same time, they can see some of the contradiction that they are participating in. And so fortunately, those records survive, and it can help us think about our own contradictory positions in this time. If we think about, well, we're all situated in a power structure and we can see some of those contradictions, what are our opportunities? And I know this is, something that we're talking about today is sort of how can we build another world, even if we are situated in a power structure that, its incentives are not towards regeneration and justice necessarily.
Right. And that is a perfect segue into, a question that was on my mind the whole time that I was reading this book, which is, we are in these power structures, big agriculture. I don't know is going to ever go away. And you know, what can people who read this book that maybe aren't connected to the agricultural industry, like on the ground, but of course we're all participants in it because
Hmm.
we all need to eat. We all get our food from farmers.
Hmm.
So, and small scale fishers and ranchers and we are part of this system no matter what. So,
Hmm.
what do you think individuals can do to
Hmm.
um I don't even know like what can individuals do to be more mindful of
Hmm.
their place in this food system? Is are there ways to um because reading books like Healing Grounds is incredible because we get to learn and see and think about these things in a much more holistic way than maybe we did before we opened this book, right? So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that within this, you know, this societal structure that, exists whether we like it or not.
Yeah, I mean, I would encourage people to be ambitious, and not think that you're any less capable of changing the world than the women featured in this book. I think they are Latrice Tatsi, Olivia Watkins, Ida Guzman, and Nikiko Masamoto. And if they were here with us today, I think that they would give you that same encouragement. That they all started as, regular people who wanted to see changes and took one step at a time and made the best of the resources around them. And I think what they're all doing is they're participating in community groups that combine two things that both build up community food systems where they are and also work on the structural barriers that are preventing the growth of those systems and that are supporting the systems that are oppressive. And so I think they would say, as an individual, you're not going to do everything. But if you can be part of a group that's engaged in both of those two things, the structural work that probably looks like policy work, even if it's defense on federal policy, like even if we're not passing some awesome, Inflation Reduction Act this year that has a bunch of incentives for regenerative agriculture, it's still really important to engage on, SNAP not being completely dismantled, for example, so that we still have like EBT market match and things like that, which are really helpful to people in building up these community food systems. So structural work is a piece of it, and then community food system work. So, Latrice is working on bison restoration in her community as a Blackfeet woman living in northwestern Montana. She also has a family cattle ranch, and she's interested in how regenerative grazing of cattle in her community can be informed by this long-standing relationship with bison. Olivia Watkins is running Black Farmer Fund, which funds small-scale Black farmers and entrepreneurs who are building up community food systems, including working with cultural foods and using regenerative methods. So I think building something in a place that provides people with an alternative,
Mhm.
whether that's food hubs, farmers markets, community gardens, school food systems. All of these things are really important ways for people to access food where they are. That's consistent with these environmental and cultural and social values. And this all allows us to kind of exercise a muscle of what it's like to be part of a reciprocal food system, and also to kind of start to build up the proof of concept in the pilot projects. And it also just makes us feel good. It like helps fuel the structural work as well, where we're like, hey, it could be like this. Let's go ahead and change the farm bill. So instead of pouring all that subsidy into continued heavily subsidized crop insurance for corn and soy in the Midwest, we take some of that public money and move it towards these kinds of food systems that serve the public good. So those two kinds of work, the community food systems work and the structural work, they have to go together and they have to be in conversation with each other. But you as an individual might have one that you gravitate to more than the other. And you can sort of choose your niche within the coalitional work. But that's what I would say in terms of, really making that impact that makes that transformation.
I think that's great, and I love how you said, that you might gravitate more towards one than the other. Because I think something that I know for me at least, and people that I have spoken with, and these are people in my bubble, of course, but I think we all feel like there's this pressure to like be perfect and do everything, and like we learn at the more that we learn, the more we want to do, and I think it's a really important reminder to do what is in your power and to do what makes sense for you where you are. So that's a really good reminder. Um, well, we have about 20 minutes left. So I'm going to move on to audience Q&A. Again, thank you to everybody who submitted some questions in advance. Keep the questions coming in, and we've gotten a couple throughout this conversation. So let's dive in. Also, someone just said, "So intrigued! Can't wait to hear this conversation." So that's exciting. I love that. Um, let's see. We have a question from Brianna who said, "What are some key challenges you have faced while working with communities, and how did you overcome them?" And I'll sort of support that question with something that I was thinking of from a writer's perspective. It's very, very common, I think, to have to engage with communities of which you're not a part, and then to build that trust. So sort of building off of that question is one that I had, which is how do you build trust in these communities where you're going in and learning, and what is it like to be a radical listener and a learner in
Mm.
these situations?
Yeah, I love that phrase, radical listener, because I think that's right on. And I think I'll also say I'm still learning how to do this. And suspect that I'll look back in 20 years and be like, oh, Liz, you should have done that. So it's an ongoing learning process. And I think humility is so important. I think that having really honest conversations, when you initiate a new conversation or a new partnership is really important. And I think some of that, elements of that is to say, hey, I'm Liz. This is what I'm doing and why, and some of that stuff for me is like sharing, like, reflecting on and then sharing. Why am I even doing this? What's in this for me? Why do I feel compelled to do this? And, my family history is a piece of this for me. My professional situation is a piece of it. And, very specifically, like, well, I'm looking to write something and I hope that it does this. I hope it gets published here and I hope these people read it and then I hope they do these things. And then also being really transparent about, how you're situated and what resources you have access to, and knowing that can and should lead to some expectations about what sorts of benefits might flow back to the person that you're talking to. Being transparent about the resources you have access to, also how you think you'll benefit from talking with them. And that has shifted over the course of my career. When I did my first book, I was a graduate student. I didn't have a lot of access to resources. I was a privileged person for sure. I didn't have like a job and I didn't have a budget. So those were different things. So I was doing kind of like mutual aid with people. It was like, hey, I know you're super busy on your farm. If you can take an hour and do an interview with me, like I'm happy to help out with childcare, animal care, like, cooking for harvest and things like that, because time was really a currency for both of us. Whereas
Mm.
writing this book, I did have a job and I was a professor and I was going up for tenure. And so I had access to a lot more resources. I did have a budget, and I also potentially was going to get like job security for life at
Right.
the other end of talking to people, which is a huge benefit. And so it's really important to be mindful about not being extractive. And so for this project, it was really important to pay people for their time doing interviews, acknowledging that I was getting paid for my time, so not really very fair. Given that I have this budget, that in other kinds of research, you would absolutely pay people. So to understand, you are a research collaborator in this context and you need to be paid for your time, including time reviewing drafts. And then out the other end, with things like we did a fair amount of like media and events in the year or two following the book, to make sure that people had the opportunity to do that. People featured in the book if that was of interest to them. So a lot of the paid speaking engagements, the sort of main featured person was one of the women featured in the book. If I was there in an unpaid role. So, just thinking about like, how do we make sure that the benefits of the work that we do together is going to come back to the knowledge holders and not just to the sort of knowledge broker or the translator. And every situation is different. So that's why I think it starts with this kind of honesty and transparency and hopefully building a long-term relationship too. I'm super excited actually. Ida Guzman just wrote, she's applying for a USDA grant. And I'm going to be a collaborator on that. And so just knowing that like, you know, you're starting a relationship and a conversation that might go way longer than the initial, story or project.
Yeah, I love that. I'm a relatively new writer in the in
Mm.
sort of freelance science world, and I have, been privileged to have that relationship with for a story that I wrote, and it's something that I hope I can continue into the future. So, yeah, and from one writer to another. That
Mm.
um, Here's a question that also taps into one that I didn't ask yet, but that I wanted to. It's from Bambang. How generalizable are the findings of this book to the global South, where agriculture has been shaped by a long history of colonialism, for example, the introduction of industrial plants such as palm oil and tobacco? And that's something that I was thinking about too, because at Rare we work primarily in the global South. Um,
Mm.
and this book is a lot about you know, the history of US agriculture, but for me, in my mind, sort of what has happened in the US has far-reaching impacts in terms of how the rest of the world is conducting itself in terms of
Mm.
agricultural practices. So yeah, posing that question to you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it really is a global story that, is sort of takes place in the US in this book because this is where I am. And I think this is where a lot of readers who haven't learned about this history are. In many ways, I think these dynamics are quite visible in parts of the global South. Although, there are ways in which they have been covered over or aren't talked about for sure. But I think in the US, there is a lot of erasure. Especially in agriculture. Like if we were having a conversation in another context, we might bring up these histories, but we almost act like it's not part of our agricultural history that there was an indigenous food system or that, like I honestly had a moment in my adulthood not that long ago when I realized that slavery happened in the context of agriculture. I mean, something as basic as that, because I learned about slavery in my social studies class and I learned about agriculture in my science class. And so those two things weren't necessarily really brought together for me to understand that, like, oh, our agricultural system in the US looks the way it does because it was created to work within the context of the plantation system. Like they designed it for that. Not
Yeah.
for a particular tractor, you know? And so you have these ideas about like, oh, well, it's this way because it's efficient or the crops need it or whatever. So I felt like it was important to highlight these sort of global dynamics around empire and colonialism here because we don't always see it here. Whereas I think in some cases it's more recent in parts of the global south, or the contestation is ongoing in ways that are visible. But I think it's absolutely a global story, and it's very much about understanding the history of a food system in a place, the indigenous food system, the traditional ecological knowledge. Who are those traditional ecological knowledge holders, and what kind of land access or ability to continue those traditions do they have? And what are the opportunities to make sure that they do have that access and those opportunities to continue those systems, where ways that researchers and writers and NGO folks can collaborate with those communities to meet common goals. And then also looking at, with that export oriented, more industrial history, how is that constraining opportunities for all small community oriented producers in a food system?
Yeah. It's something that you mentioned, about the way that the U.S. agriculture system is, set up, and it has these roots in, you know, in enslavement and all of these, different power structures. You called in the book the way that we are sort of taught to think about um, our agriculture in the US as our national agrarian myth. And it was something that I like highlighted and starred and dog-eared the page
Mm,
because I just thought that phrase, I mean, it's so, you know, powerful and short, but that's really what it is. It's like we have this myth about how, the our agriculture system was designed and how it's supposed to work. And,
mm.
to sort of pull the curtain back a little is really powerful.
Yeah, and we're not just losing something by letting go of a story that is incomplete and deliberately erases other stories, and embracing something more complex. I think especially right now, and especially when I think about, the wide range of people I've been in conversation with over the last 10 or 12 years, we're gaining something actually by demanding a more complete and more complex story. We're gaining the ability to actually solve our problems and their root causes, but we're also gaining like a more textured, and I would argue like more beautiful understanding of our history. And I'll just say that's been my experience, as a person who, had a certain period of time where I was like, okay, great. I have ancestors who were homesteaders. I have inherited this agricultural legacy. It wasn't super simple because of the Dust Bowl, but there was a certain like, that story worked for me for a while. And then to now be in a place where I see a much more complex story that does include a lot of equity work and the need for repatriation and reparation and all of that, I have gained something. Like I have a richer sense of what I'm doing and what it means to be part of my family's agricultural legacy. So, for people out there who are worried that this is a loss to embrace a more complex story, I would just encourage people to keep at it. Or if you have friends or family in your life who are concerned about this, that there really is something more beautiful and complex and ultimately effective at the other end of it that I think will especially help as we're seeing a lot of white family farmers, losing their land and their farms and their economic opportunities. I think when we realize that the processes that are undermining those farms start with this colonial legacy, then we understand how to work together with people who have common interests.
Yeah, and I think that there's something to be said about, where, a lot of us come from. Like, well, as I was reading this book, I thought about how when I was younger, my dad used to go out into our yard and pick dandelions and say, like, these are, everyone thinks these are weeds, but, he's from a small farming community in southern Italy, and
Mm,
my family's only been here for 2 generations, and picking dandelions were like like that's something that we would eat, and it's something that he eventually stopped doing. I have a clear memory of him not doing that anymore because there was this pressure to have like a green lawn in America, and like the sorts of chemicals you have to put into your grass in order to do that, and to like so I think that there's a lot of commonalities in terms of like our individual heritages and how we are connected to the land that I think we lose as we, sort of fall into this big agriculture structure that we're all sort of in. Um, Probably have time for like one more question. And I think the end of your answer to the last question is probably a really good segue into this, but it's from Alexandra. What do you think is necess- is a what do you think is a major factor needed to shift from conventional to regenerative agriculture? I think on like a more wider scale.
Mm, yeah. Well, it's so hard to boil it down to one. I've heard the brilliant Leah Penniman answer this question, and she's like, "We don't need one thing; we actually need many things, which is why we need lots of friends." It's like we'll all work on the one thing, but those different one things will add up. Because I really do think it's at these different scales and these different intervention points. For example, I think it will be very difficult for the United States to transition to regenerative agriculture in a meaningful way with our current crop insurance system because it just makes it too easy for people in Iowa, in Illinois, in Minnesota to keep farming corn and soy the way that they have been because the government makes them whole, whether they harvest it or not. And honestly, even as the climate resilience of those systems becomes sort of more and more fragile, they actually have more and more of an incentive to keep doing it because it's the crop insurance they get that will make them whole after their field gets rained out. So, one thing in the United States that really needs to change is that subsidized crop insurance that sort of keeps people in the systems that they have is sort of a like perverse reverse incentive for resilience. So we need to do those big policy things in national governments and with as much international cooperation as we can. But we also really need to do these bottom up things like school food procurement is also like an incredibly powerful lever that people have engaged in all over the world. I think Brazil has done an amazing job at various points in its history of linking sort of food security programs and small farmers using agroecological and regenerative practices. We've done little bits of that in parts of the United States, often on a state level or a local level. And so you can intervene at any of those levels, local, state, or national. But thinking about how large institutions like schools, hospitals can, first of all, have a decent budget for food in the first place, and then use it to say, hey, we are going to procure food from regenerative farms within a radius of this institution. That can be a super powerful lever that multiplies the impact of like an individual's purchases by, thousands, millions. So all kinds of different things that we need to do from the sort of top down to the bottom up. But I think the key thing is that we need to do them in coalition and sort of talking to each other.
Yeah. Okay, with our last 5 minutes, I'm going to ask a question that I again, also had in my list of questions, but didn't ask. But a lot of people are popping up in the chat with questions about engaging young people. Um, what someone that's asking is actually Momo, who works for RARE in our Lands for Life Columbia Regenerative Agriculture Program. Um, but it's something that we think about a lot. I mean, gender equity is a huge piece of the puzzle. And I think also getting young people involved um, in the regenerative, I mean, in agriculture in general, but like in regenerative agricultural practices. So, in your talks with people for the book, like how have you seen, and you're a professor, and I think you primarily only teach undergrad at this moment, right? So,
Yeah.
I mean, what are you seeing in terms of like youth engagement in these farming practices? And is it inspiring for you to see like this new generation carrying on these legacies? Wondering if you can speak to that real quick to end.
Yeah, well, and all the women in this book are younger than me, which was also very humbling and kind of a first. My career as a writer has mostly involved talking to my elders. And this was like, whoa, these are people who are making these huge transformational changes, and they're all younger than I am. And their stories in the book often start, kind of when they are young adults as they're finding their way into this path. I see a lot of interest. I think a lot of young people all over the world are interested in doing, meaningful, purposeful, real work, where you can see the tangible impact and you know that you're leaving a positive legacy for your community, for your family, for future generations. I think basically for older generations, we just have to show people the opportunity and the economic opportunity. And so it's a long way of saying, like, we just need to give people decent jobs. We need to pay people to do this rather than assume, that like it's all going to be sort of volunteer based youth engagement. Because I think youth around the world, we know we're living in an economy that is really chaotic. Cost of living is a real issue, not just for youth in the US, but other places. And so I think, there again on the structural side, if we can create the structures that create good jobs, even if it's like a shortish term job as a young person, but if we can offer people jobs that allow them to meet that cost of living and have a high quality of life, I think that we will see that there are actually probably more people in younger generations interested in doing this work than there was like a generation or two ago.
Yeah. Well, I could keep this conversation going for a very long time, but to be mindful of everyone's time and yours, I will end it there. Liz, thank you so much for joining me today, for having this conversation. I learned so much, and you've given, I think, everybody a lot to think about. Um, if you haven't yet read Healing Grounds, please do. I promise you it will change the way that you see everything. um, and if you have not yet subscribed to Rare Reads, we'll put the link in the bio. Not in the bio, that's not what I meant. In the chat, we'll put the link in the chat. And you can stay up to date on future author talks, our future book recommendations. So be sure to subscribe to that. Liz, thank you again so much. It was a real pleasure talking with you.
Thank you so much, Christy. And thanks everybody for joining. I know for some of you it was the beginning of the morning, for some of you it's probably night. So thanks for taking time out of your day to join the conversation and ask such great questions.
Yes, thank you, everyone. All right, enjoy the rest of your day, Liz. Thank you.
Take care.